sure is nice to be back. It's been a few years, and I date myself by talking about the first couple times I came here, but it was 2 decades ago, or even more. And I've been in the Crystal once before, but a long, long time, and it's good to be back. I feel like I know as many people here as I do just about anywhere I might play outside of Salt Lake, which is my home, and that's always adds a little spice too. That song is called Hot Spot. 30 seconds of that song were used. I guess you could say it was a bit of a kind of a commission as a the audio background for a carpooling commercial that was supposed to run before and during the Winter Olympics of '02 in Salt Lake. It didn't run. It turned out the whole carpooling bit fell apart when we found out that they were building a special lane for just bigwigs that belonged to the IOC. And the rest of us would be carpooling in the other lane so they could cruise in their limo. So the whole plan, the carpooling plan, about exhorting us to do our civic duty kind of fell apart. We call it Slalom and Gomorrah by the time the whole deal was This is another original one I wrote for the only neighborhood bar left in my neighborhood. We only had 2 or 3 to begin with 40 years ago, and they've been sort of remodeled or constructed out of existence now. Utah doesn't have a proud history of neighborhood bars. So cherish the ones that you have, the ones you can walk home from, or people know your name. That's what a neighborhood bar is. This is just called Tap Room. came from a trip down into the desert where I took a little travel guitar with a melodic idea in the back of my head, and I started messing with it on that trip, and somehow that got mixed up with a poem I learned in the 10th grade and had to recite, and then had forgotten until that trip, and 40 or 35 years later, there I am remembering every word of the poem. Somehow it seemed apropos to the political situation and the trip and everything, and I put it out on an album called Sounds of Wood and Steel that Windham Hill label put out a couple of years ago. They had solicited me to contribute a piece to it, and they have a piece by Dave Matthews on there, and one by Richie Sambora. There's all these people on there, all these relatively heavy hitters, and then Moa here with my piece. And this album came out, and I don't know what happened, but I think it sold about 12 copies. You know, I was expecting big things. Windham Hill, you know. It just sucked, and I get these, you know, now when they must have thought it was going to sell because they gave me money up front, which is cool. That's why I did it. But now I get these statements telling me how many they sold and how much money I still owe them, as I'm supposed to be paying them back for the money they gave me. That was supposed to be an advance against future earnings. Now the cool thing is you don't ever have to pay it back. I mean, they can't come and get you, but they just keep sending you statements that say, now you've made a minus $3,821. I just got it one before this trip started, and I'm down to $3,759. So it's going to have to be like 200 years of CD sales at that rate before I'm in the black and start making any money on it. So the whole thing irritated me horribly, plus they did things to the sound I didn't like, so I changed it a bit and re-recorded it for an album that'll be coming out in February. But the song is called Ozymandias, and you get the poem too as a bonus feature for tonight. The old Shelley poem that you may have actually heard or read. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shadowed visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Well, I thought it over a while back and decided I wasn't traveling enough, and I needed to go to Italy and play some music. And then a few months before the trip began, it ended about a year ago, a little over a year ago, the first trip. I got panicked and figured I better learn some Italian. So I got these tapes, and listened to them, and they were pretty helpful, especially for checking into and out of hotels and ordering red wine with your meal. Didn't have much in the way of what to talk to people about from the stage. So I had a little red dictionary about this big, and I'd look up words as in the first week of the trip was pleasure and getting kind of acclimated, and then there was the musical part. So I'd be writing out little words I thought I would need, but the dictionary didn't have words like 12-string or open tuning, or the song was canzone, but it frustrated me because I knew I was going to say calzone by mistake on the stage some point, Vorrei suonare questa canzone or calzone, and then go, oh, he's going to play this really nice folded over like dough sandwich for us. So I rehearsed a few things, and I was doing all right, and I was feeling pretty good. And first concert was in Torino, and where we had a little bit in common because they were just about, they just recovered from their Olympics, and there I was to tell them all about it. Well, I wanted to play these songs here I'm going to play for you. And there are tre canzoni, un canzone di musica etnica di Irlanda, musica celtica, capite?
Sì.
Okay. And un canzone di musica classica di Johann Sebastian Bach. Okay, so 3 songs, but I wanted to explain it was a medley, and I didn't know the word for medley. So, I'm trying to make up a word for medley, thinking about what would it be. I knew some food stuff because I've been eating, so I thought, pasticcio. Like a pasticcio, I'll try pasticcio. Un pasticcio de tre canzoni. Everybody's looking at me. And then I think, well, maybe, because every time at the end of the meal I'd have these insalata mista, mixed salad. So I'd try tre canzoni misti. And they're looking at me like, what's this guy talking about? So, maybe this whole thing took a minute. But a minute is a relative thing, and a minute is a long time when you're a doofus in front of people that, and I could have assumed, but I didn't want to, that they'd comprehend if I didn't want to speak any Italian, but I wanted to. So after maybe a minute and a half of floundering around, the guy gets up in the front row and turns around towards the audience, and he says to everybody, he puts out his hands, he says, "It's a medley." And later he told me, he took me under his wing and gave me some advice, and he said, he said that first of all, that medley is a barbarismo, is a word that's leaked in, even though we should have Italians with the musical heritage they have, there should be a perfect word for medley, but there isn't, so they call it un medley. And these, by the way, are scarpe di bowling, in case you're curious. And folk is folk, musica, folk. And CD is un CD. I just got an email from a friend, Beppe Gambetta, who just toured the US and got home, and he told me, he says, "Ritorno in Genoa e sono molto spaced out." So here we have tre canzoni misti, un medley di tre canzoni. Musica celtica, and musica di cellulare, anche. Che peccato. Grazie mille e molto gentili da parte vostra.